Hello, welcome to Papa Nick's Music. I am, as always, your host, Papa Nick Lewis, and today it's been a hell of a week here in the United States. A little over a week ago, an event occurred that caused a great deal of upheaval here, and I feel compelled to talk a little bit about that upheaval. Before I start, though, I want to make one thing abundantly clear. I am not talking about the event. I have absolutely nothing of value to add to the already rampant discussion of the event, so I'm not even remotely talking about it. What I feel compelled to talk about is the aftermath and one of the elements that I, and many others, think is fueling the discourse, and that is good old fashioned American white supremacy. Before I get into that, though, I have to give you a little background about myself. I've mentioned several times in various videos that I grew up in a small rural town in eastern Oklahoma. If, by the way, you're one of my childhood friends and you're watching this video, as I know some of you do, buckle up. Things are about to get uncomfortable. When I've talked about my hometown, it's usually in the context of explaining some element of my taste in popular culture. We had limited access to television and radio, and extremely limited access to things like concerts and theater performances, and that limited access played a significant role in the development of my artistic tastes. But there's something else about life in my hometown that also played a significant role in my development into the man I have become. The town where I grew up was a sundown town. This is not a label that I placed on the town. I heard multiple adults refer to the town that way when I lived there, invariably with a faint glow of pride. For us, diversity didn't refer to racial demographics. The racial diversity of my hometown when I was a child was one Filipino family and the fairly small group of folks who were visibly of Native American descent. No, in my town, diversity was limited to which Protestant church your family attended. And this was my reality. My family moved to this town when I was 5, so I haven't lived there, or hadn't at that point lived there all my life. But I have few scattered, disjointed memories of my life before the move, so for all practical purposes, I am from this town. Now, for the bulk of my childhood, while we lived in the town, my dad worked overseas for an oil drilling company. He didn't work for Shell Oil, but the company he worked for contracted with Shell to actually operate rigs. He worked abroad and we stayed in Oklahoma. But there were a couple of times that we got to live overseas with him. One of those times was when I was 12 years old. We moved to Port Harcourt, Nigeria for a year. That year was extremely influential in my life for 3 reasons. One, like I just said, I turned 12 with all of the impending puberty-related hormone shifts and innate desire to start establishing myself as a functioning human independent from my family that you get at that time. 2, Nigeria was demographically the diametric opposite of a sundown town, which presented me with an obviously stark contrast. And 3, because there was so little to do day to day, I read a shitload of books during that year. This was the year that I read Tolkien's Hobbit and Lord of the Rings for the first time, for example. And one of the books that I read that year was Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. In the confluence of these 3 things, I decided deliberately, consciously, that I would be an anti-racist. So I started working to uproot and toss all the racial crap that I knew, that I could see festering in the corners of my mind. I knew I had been socialized with racist attitudes, although precocious as I was, I didn't have the vocabulary to express it. And I knew that I didn't want that. So I actively started unlearning those attitudes. And for the most part, I did a good job of it. It didn't take long for me to add misogyny and homophobia to my list of things that I could tell had been installed in my psyche, but that I didn't want. So I spent a good long time ripping that shit out and tossing it away. I would still find myself from time to time slipping into the old attitudes. Frustrated, I'd rip them out and I'd toss them again and tell myself to do better next time. Fast forward several years. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed into law. Later, in 1992, when enforcement of the act began, companies across the country held workshops and seminars to train their employees on the impact of this legislation on their jobs. I was working as a part-time teacher and tutor at several community colleges in the Houston area at this time, and one of those colleges, I cannot remember which, required attendance at one of these workshops for continued employment. Now, in my career, I have attended a shitload of workshops like this. Diversity trainings, sensitivity trainings, leadership trainings, team building trainings. Like I said, a shitload of these things. And while I've never disliked going to them, I've always thought of them like field trips when you were in school. They never really made much of an impact on me. I always felt like I was the choir being preached to. But this ADA training, this training was different. I came into the training thinking, well, of course, providing reasonable accommodation is a good thing. Why would anyone think otherwise? But one element of the training focused on developing job qualifications and the need to separate qualifications that were prejudicial out. We talked about how to determine if a physical requirement for a job were truly a requirement or whether it was just a product of the way the job had always been done before. If, for example, you employ cashiers, you might have as a job requirement that prospective cashiers must be able to stand for a certain length of time, since at your store your cashiers have always stood at the register. But there isn't anything in the job of being a cashier that actually inherently requires that person to stand. Refusing to even consider hiring a person who can't stand for a job that doesn't inherently require standing was the exact kind of prejudice that the ADA was passed to counteract. I had never considered that. I had never thought to separate out what was necessary from what was accustomed. At about the same time, I was working part-time at a college learning center, tutoring writing and conducting workshops in study skills. My supervisor was a wonderful woman with whom I got along like a house on fire. I loved working for her. I loved working with her. Her boss, though, I didn't care much for at all. Her boss, chair, dean, VP, I don't remember what her actual title was. I thought that she was incompetent. Her lack of ability it came off of her in waves. So I'm sitting in the learning center one day, shortly after this training that I had gone through. I'm looking at my boss's boss through the glass partition that was her office wall. The office that used to be my boss's office before this new boss's boss moved in, and which, if I'm being honest, was likely a good chunk of the reason why I didn't like her. And for whatever karmic reason, I found myself thinking about that training, thinking about separating what was necessary from what was accustomed. I sat there looking at the incompetent person and wondering to myself why I had thought she was incompetent. I knew what her job duties were, and while she didn't conduct them in the way I would have if I had been in her place, she still did them, and she did them successfully. I knew what the education and experience requirements were for the job, and I knew that she had those requirements. I couldn't think, as I sat there, I couldn't think of a single specific thing she had ever done to make me think of her as incompetent. And then, in a burst of recognition, I realized, to my shame, why I had thought that. She was a black woman. And of course, I thought at the time, that meant she had to have been given the job to fulfill a racial quota. Now, here's the thing. Honestly, I don't know if I'd ever actually thought that out. I don't know if I actually, made that distinction. I honestly believe that the assumption that I made was a subconscious one. But still, in that moment, I knew that I had made that assumption. All of my years of patting myself on the back for being anti-racist went right out the door, and I realized that I had spent decades painting over the rot instead of removing it. I was intentionally anti-racist, but I was functionally a white supremacist. And that was when I realized that white supremacy isn't limited to wearing a Klan hood and burning crosses. White supremacy is also hidden. It's buried in the preferences and system settings of our brains. That day when I was so fortunate to have two ideas that I thought were both right, yet were contradictory, collide into one another, and one of the ideas actually beat the other one. I went through my brain's system settings and I started unselecting the preferences that favored white over black, male over female, straight over gay. I've had a few setbacks over the years, which have shown me that every once in a while during a system update, those old preferences can be checked back on without my knowledge. Default settings are like that. But I've found, for the most part, that a little vigilance on my part keeps the settings where I want them. Now, why am I bringing all this up today? I mentioned up top that we had a huge event take place in the U.S. last week. A man was murdered, and in the aftermath, a lot of discussion has taken place regarding the things the man has said and stood for in his life. Some folks have claimed that the man built his notoriety on saying incendiary things, while others have claimed that those incendiary remarks were taken out of context. For example, this is one of those incendiary things presented in context. If we would have said 3 weeks ago that Joy Reid and Michelle Obama and Sheila Jackson Lee and Ketanji Brown Jackson were affirmative action picks, we would have been called racist. But now they're coming out and saying it for us. They're coming out and they're saying, I'm only here because of affirmative action. Yeah, we know. You do not have the brain processing power to otherwise be taken really seriously. You had to go steal a white person's slot to go be taken somewhat seriously. Yes, this is the context that is supposed to make this quotation non-racist. I would argue not just that full quotation is racist, but also it runs counter to my experience. In all my years of experience, I've worked in many places in many capacities. When I reflect back on that experience, when I think of all of the people who've worked with me, who've worked for me, whom I have worked for, people whose work I was able to evaluate objectively because of my own training and expertise. In all of that time, I have known exactly one incompetent black woman. One. But reflecting back on that time, I can't think of a single place where I've ever worked where there wasn't at least one incompetent white man. And most places have multiple incompetent white men. Incompetent white men are a dime a dozen in the workplace. Throw a dart, you'll hit 2 of them. So why are so many of us engaging in hagiography for this guy? Why was he as popular as he was in the first place? I'd argue that there are a lot of us, who have a vested interest in making sure enough of us don't change those system settings. It's attractive and comforting to think that my life is miserable because they took whatever from me. While there are a lot of folks who are making money off of my comfort maintenance, though, it's my insistence on clinging to a fantasy that makes me believe I'm inherently better than others that is the true problem, I think. I fully believe that for a lot of us, even as we agree with the folks feeding us very thinly disguised white supremacy and lapping it up eagerly, we still say with a straight face that we aren't racist, and we think we're being completely honest. I believe this because I've lived it. I don't live it anymore because it simply takes too much effort to maintain the suspension of disbelief. My own experience tells me that white supremacy doesn't have to be a terminal condition. My fear is that not enough of us care enough to ensure that it isn't. And that's what I've been thinking about this week. What do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Leave that note down below, he said, steeling himself for the results. I usually love hearing from you. If you liked today's video, I'd appreciate it if you click the like button while you're down there clicking. If you haven't already done so, I'd appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to me, so I very much appreciate it. Thanks again for hanging out with me today, and I hope that the rest of your day is, ironically, peaceful. See you soon.